Hey everyone. So tonight I'm going to tell a story that's a little bit more somber than other stories I tell. It's a true story, really happened, unfortunately. But I think it's one that needs to be shared. I think we need to understand it. So, remember when you were a kid and your teacher gave you a gold star and how important that was and how good that was? Well, as I got older, I come to realize that gold stars are not something you want to be handed out. Not if you're a mother and not if your child's in the service. And unfortunately, I have gotten to know some gold star mothers. You see, back when my kids grew up, my son became a Marine. And Marines go to war. And he went. Him and 21 of his closest Marine buddies formed a platoon, and they were sent overseas, not once but twice. The first deployment was not that bad. It was actually pretty easy for me, easy for him. They stayed in the barracks a lot. It wasn't that much of a big deal. Second deployment, however, was totally different scene. And on September, well, I'll digress for a minute. September 2010, a group of parents all met on the base, and we took our boys out to eat before they were deployed the next day. And we went to Applebees of all places, and we got a little too loud, and Applebees even kicked us out. The nerve. But they did. And of course, the Marines loved it. They loved that their parents got a little too rowdy with them, and we all had to be thrown out of Applebee's. I mean, they just thought that was the hoot. So anything to make them happy, because they were deploying for war the next day. Anyway, 3 weeks into their deployment, I felt like something was wrong. I felt there was a day I just couldn't, I had an uneasiness about the day. And I owned my own business, and I worked with my children and my husband, and a couple of my children and my husband, and I kept telling them, there's something not right. I just feel so uneasy today. Something's not right. So I went back to my office and I scoured Facebook to see if I could see anything on Facebook. And I did see one of the girlfriends of one of the platoon members talk about how her boyfriend had been injured. So I thought, oh gosh, no, there's been an injury. And so that put me more on edge. Then my phone rang. And on the other side of the phone was my son's in the barracks. He had a roommate, his roommate of 3.5 years. It was his mother. And the first thing she says to me was, "How is Price?" Because my son has died. Now, I don't even remember how I responded. I just know that it was a sucker punch to the gut, and I can't even believe she had the wherewithal to call me and ask about my son, to care about my son. I don't know how she did it. I'm still in awe of it to this day. But she did. And in fact, when she made the phone call to me, the officers, the casualty officers, were still in her living room telling her about her son. And the first thought she has was to call me to make sure my son was okay, because she knew they were like peas in a pod. So if her son died, then there were, I guess, chances that my son could have been right beside him. So, I mean, how this woman even managed to pick up the phone and call me, I do not know. But she did, and she was very concerned for me. Can you believe that? And she told me not to go home. She said, "Don't go home. In case they're there, you don't want to go home to them. You don't," and she was meaning the casualty officers. So I was already uneasy. I was already a basket case in general. I didn't go home. I had my husband go home and search the house first. In the meantime, I stayed behind, and I called the family readiness officer, and I was demanding him tell me who else was injured, what else happened. Of course, he didn't even have the information. I was getting it like hot off the press, straight from the mother, as she was being told. Anyway, suffice it to say, my son was fine. But it took hours before we got confirmation of that. I mean hours, like 6, 8 hours. And it was the worst 6 to 8 hours of my life. I'm going to fast forward a couple of weeks. You don't get a chance to talk to your child. They go on blackout. So all I wanted to do was hear his voice and know that he was okay. He just lost his friend, his buddy, his roommate of 3.5 years. They're in a war. I want to hear my son's voice, but I can't. I'm not allowed to. Nobody's allowed to. They're on blackout. So 3 weeks go by, and we're going down to the funeral of this brave Marine, and we're going to see his Gold Star parents, his Gold Star mom. We've talked on the phone a couple of times in between, and she knew my son was okay. That was a big concern for her. Anyway, actually another Marine who got out a year earlier came and drove down from another state so he could hop a ride with us to go even further to go to this other Marine's funeral. And let me tell you, if you've never attended a funeral of a military, a young man that you know, and a young man that, well, we pull up to the funeral parlor, and here's the thing that stood out the most. Standing guard at the funeral parlor, I guess some whatever those well, I can't remember, those crazy people, the Westbrook Baptist Church or something, the ones that used to protest military funerals, I guess they had threatened to protest. So standing guard at the funeral all around the church were motorcycle men in their chaps and their t-shirts and their bandanas, but standing guard and saluting and holding up American flags, and it was a sight to behold. In fact, it's really hard to even talk about. To this day, my husband and I, when we recall the memory of that scene, we could easily break down in tears, easily. And then when we got in, oh gosh, there were so many personal things. My son's picture was everywhere with his roommate of 3.5 years. They were in multiple pictures. There was a video going. There was, I swear, thousands of people there. But the Gold Star family, the Gold Star mom, pulled me out in the midst of all of her family, in the midst of all of her friends, people she knew her a lifetime, and clung to me because I was the closest thing to her son. Was me and my son. Anyway, the funeral was absolutely heart-wrenching and beautiful at the same time. And the Marine we took down there with us, him and I shared a box of Kleenex. I think we went through maybe a couple. But a lot of details about that don't need to be discussed, but it was very beautiful. So after the funeral, we were invited back to her home. We were the only people besides family invited back to her home. And so we went, of course. We went back to her home where my phone rang. Actually, I'll be honest with you, I don't remember if it was my phone or her phone. But a phone rang, and it was for her, and it was my son. And they had allowed my son to call her the day of her son's funeral. And so I got to hear his voice for just a second, because this call was not for me. This call was for her, and it was for him, and they needed it. And I will never forget, and I will never be able to thank this woman for the grace she showed my son on that day during that phone call, the day of her son's funeral. He needed it, and she needed it. In fact, years later, when my son had a son, he named him in part after her son. So, I guess the moral of the story is, I am thankful, and Memorial Day is here, and so it's a Memorial Day story. And I am so thankful for that Gold Star mom. And she knows who she is. I don't have to tell her name. And although, honestly, that's the most tragic thing that I've ever seen, my son joining the Marine Corps brought him a family, an extended family, that is closer than anything I've ever seen. He's closer to those men that he served with. Those men are my sons, hands down. That's it, and they all know who they are. But anyway, on this Memorial Day, I want to give a shout out to the grace of all the Gold Star moms and all the parents that have lost service members. And I want us to remember the sacrifices they've made, and the sacrifices, of course, the servicemen have made. Not just the parents, but the spouses, the siblings. This happened 10 years ago, and almost 10 years ago. And there are days that it feels like it was yesterday. But I will never forget, and I will always be thankful to a Gold Star mom. I love you all. Please thank a military person this Memorial Day. Have a great day.